"I haven't seen a man in 9 years," Ruth whispered, her rifle trembling in weathered hands. The words escaped before she could cage them. Before logic could intervene, she dropped the weapon and pressed her lips to the stranger's mouth with desperate hunger. The kiss lasted 3 heartbeats. Then horror crashed over her like mountain ice. She stumbled backward, snatching up her rifle. The wounded cowboy stared at her with eyes the color of creek stones. Blood seeped through his torn shirt. His horse lay collapsed nearby, foam flecking its muzzle. Ruth's sanctuary had been violated. 9 years of perfect solitude shattered by this bleeding stranger who'd somehow breached her defenses. The Sierra Nevada peaks stretched endlessly around them, their snow-crowned heads catching the last amber light of day. Ruth had chosen this place for its isolation. Every approach was visible for miles. Every trail was trapped. Every warning system had failed. Wind stirred the aspens, their leaves whispering secrets she'd forgotten how to hear. The man's breathing came ragged. His left shoulder bore a bullet's signature. Fresh blood meant fresh pursuit. Ruth studied his face, memorizing scars and sun lines. Broad shoulders spoke of hard work. Calloused hands gripped nothing but air. A leather satchel lay beside him, its surface worn smooth by constant handling. She'd built her refuge with deliberate care. The cabin sat nestled against granite walls, invisible from below. Hand-carved wind chimes hung from ancient pines, their wooden voices announcing any intrusion. Mirror fragments caught sunlight, flashing warnings across the peaks. For 9 years, no human foot had crossed her threshold. Ruth Reverie had earned her solitude. The world below held nothing but betrayal and bitter memories. Here, among the eternal stones, she'd found peace. She knew every deer path, every water source, every cave that offered shelter from winter storms. The stranger shifted, wincing. His eyes never left her face. No fear there, despite the rifle barrel aimed at his chest. Something else flickered in that gray gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or gratitude. Ruth's grandmother's voice echoed in memory, speaking of healing herbs and wounded creatures. The old woman had never turned away suffering, even when kindness carried a price. Blood continued its slow leak from the man's shoulder. Without treatment, infection would claim him within days. The high country showed no mercy to the wounded. Her finger tightened on the trigger. One squeeze would end this complication, preserve her sanctuary, maintain the boundaries she'd spent 9 years perfecting. The stranger's lips moved soundlessly, not pleading, not begging, accepting whatever judgment she chose to render. Ruth lowered the rifle an inch. Her pulse hammered against her throat like trapped wings. 9 years since she'd heard another human voice. 9 years since she'd felt the warmth of human skin. The kiss burned in her memory. Desperate, foolish, real. Wind shifted through the pines, carrying new sounds. Distant hoofbeats echoed off stone walls. The rhythm spoke of multiple riders, spreading wide, searching methodically. The stranger's eyes sharpened. His good hand moved toward the leather satchel with protective instinct. Ruth recognized pursuit when she heard it. She'd run from such sounds before, in another life, in another valley where smoke had risen from burning homes and justice wore badges of tin. 3 gunshots cracked across the peaks, signal shots spaced wide. The hunters were closing their net. The wounded man struggled to sit upright. Fresh blood darkened his shirt. His jaw clenched against pain, but he made no sound. Whatever he carried in that satchel mattered enough to die for. Ruth counted heartbeats between echo and origin. The shots had come from 3 different positions. Professional hunters, not angry townsmen or drunken cowboys. These men knew their business. Her refuge was no longer safe. 9 years of careful isolation hung in the balance. Every instinct screamed at her to let this stranger bleed out in silence. Let his pursuers find only bones when winter retreated. But her grandmother's hands moved within her own, phantom fingers remembering the weight of healing. Ruth had sworn off human connection, not human decency. The leather satchel drew her attention. Its weight seemed important, the way the stranger protected it even while bleeding. Men didn't risk death for empty leather. More hoofbeats drifted up from the valleys below. The search was tightening. Soon they would find the trail that led to her hidden world. Ruth made her choice with the same cold calculation she'd used to survive 9 winters alone. Not from kindness, not from attraction, from pure practical necessity. If these hunters found her sanctuary, isolation would become impossible. Better to help this stranger fight than face them alone. She shouldered her rifle and extended one rough hand toward the wounded man. The stranger's weight pressed against Ruth's shoulder as she half-carried him toward the cabin. His boots carved deep furrows in soil that had known only her footprints for 9 years. Each step cost him. Blood left a trail the hunters would follow come morning. Ruth's sanctuary revealed itself gradually through the trees. The cabin crouched against granite walls, weathered wood blending into shadow. Hand-split shingles caught no moonlight. Windows faced away from the valleys below. She'd built this place to disappear. The wounded man's breathing came shallow and quick. Fever would follow soon. Ruth recognized the signs from tending injured animals, from memories of her grandmother's steady hands working over bullet wounds and broken bones. Inside, the cabin held 9 years of solitude. Herbs hung in neat bundles from ceiling beams. Shelves lined the walls, filled with preserved foods and carefully hoarded supplies. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney hidden among the rocks above. Ruth lowered the stranger onto her bed. The only bed, her private space now violated by necessity. His eyes tracked her movements while she gathered supplies. Water heated over banked coals. Clean cloth torn from precious reserves. The leather satchel remained clutched against his chest with protective desperation. Ruth had learned healing from watching death. Her grandmother's knowledge lived in her fingers, in the way she mixed herbs and cleaned wounds. Some wisdom survived even after the world burned everything else away. The bullet had passed through cleanly. Muscle damage, not bone. Blood loss was the enemy now, along with infection and the fever that would follow. Ruth worked without speaking, her hands remembering skills she'd hoped never to use again. The stranger's skin burned hot under her touch. He watched her face while she worked, studying her features with the intensity of a man memorizing his last sunset. No fear there, only curiosity and something deeper she couldn't name. His clothes told stories, quality fabric worn thin by hard use, boots that had walked thousands of miles, hands that knew rope and leather and the weight of responsibility. Not a common drifter, something more. The satchel drew her attention again. Its leather surface bore the marks of careful use. Whatever it contained mattered more than his life. Men didn't guard empty pouches while bleeding out in strange women's beds. Ruth bound his shoulder with strips of cotton. Her grandmother's voice whispered instructions, mixing memory with instinct. Willow bark for fever, echinacea for infection, comfrey root to speed healing. The wounded man's eyes followed her every movement. He recognized some of the herbs she used. His lips moved silently, naming them. Few men possessed such knowledge. Fewer still would trust their lives to a strange woman's healing. Outside, night deepened around the cabin. Ruth's warning systems remained silent, but the hunters were out there. Men who tracked wounded prey with professional skill. They would find the blood trail come dawn. She lit no candles. Firelight might betray them to watching eyes. Instead, Ruth worked by touch and instinct, cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. The stranger submitted to her ministrations without complaint. His silence spoke of discipline and pain held close. When the immediate work was finished, Ruth stepped back. The man's fever was rising. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the mountain cold. His breathing had steadied but remained shallow. He tried to speak. Ruth pressed a finger to her lips. Sound carried strangely in these peaks. Whispers might reach unfriendly ears. The leather satchel never left his grip. Even unconscious with fever, his fingers remained locked around its strap. Ruth found herself wondering what secrets justified such devotion. What knowledge was worth bleeding for in these empty mountains? She settled into her grandmother's rocking chair, keeping watch. The rifle lay across her knees, loaded and ready. 9 years of solitude had taught her patience. She could wait. She could listen. She could kill if necessary. The stranger's fever peaked near midnight. He muttered words she couldn't catch, his body fighting battles on multiple fronts. Ruth bathed his forehead with cool water, fighting the infection with her grandmother's remedies and her own stubborn will. Dawn would bring decisions. The hunters would find their trail. Her sanctuary would be compromised. 9 years of careful isolation would crumble because she'd chosen mercy over wisdom. But something in the stranger's face reminded her of who she'd been before the mountains claimed her, before fear became her closest companion, before loneliness felt safer than trust. The leather satchel shifted as he moved restlessly in fevered dreams. Ruth glimpsed metal inside. Not coins, something official, something that carried weight beyond mere silver. Wind stirred the aspens outside, their leaves whispering warnings she'd learned to read. Multiple riders approached from 3 different directions. The hunters had found her valley. Dawn would bring consequences she couldn't avoid. Ruth checked her rifle and counted ammunition. Enough for a brief fight, not enough for a siege. The mountains that had protected her for 9 years might become her tomb. The stranger's eyes opened suddenly, clear despite the fever. He looked directly at her, seeing past the weapon to something deeper. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words meant only for her. "Trust me." Ruth stared back, weighing 9 years of safety against one moment of human connection. The leather satchel held secrets that men killed for. The wounded stranger carried knowledge that justified pursuit across empty wilderness. Outside, hoofbeats echoed off stone walls. The hunters had arrived. The riders circled Ruth's valley in the gray hour before dawn. Their horses' breath steamed in the thin air. Leather creaked. Metal clinked against saddle rings. Professional sounds that spoke of men who knew their business. Ruth pressed herself against the cabin wall, peering through a gap in the chinked logs. 3 riders visible, more hidden in the tree line. They moved with military precision, cutting off escape routes she'd spent years memorizing. The wounded stranger struggled to sit upright. His fever had broken during the night, leaving him weak but clear-headed. The leather satchel remained clutched against his chest. Ruth gestured for silence. Her fingers found the hidden lever beside the window. 9 years of preparation had taught her to think in layers. The cabin held secrets within secrets. The lead rider dismounted near the blood trail. A giant of a man with shoulders that blocked out starlight. He knelt beside the dark stains, touching them with one thick finger, still wet, still fresh. Ruth's pulse hammered against her throat. The stranger beside her breathed carefully, conserving strength. His eyes had sharpened with the approach of danger. Whatever weakness the fever had brought was burning away. The giant straightened and made hand signals to his men. They spread wider, forming a net around the hidden cabin. Ruth counted 7 riders total, too many for a direct fight. Her rifle held 6 shots. The stranger shifted beside her. His good hand moved toward his belt, finding an empty holster. Ruth had taken his weapon while he burned with fever. Trust only went so far. She retrieved his Colt from her supply shelf. The metal was warm from proximity to the fire, well maintained. The grip showed wear from constant use. A working gun, not a showpiece. Their eyes met as she placed the weapon in his palm. 9 years of isolation weighed against this moment of shared trust. Ruth had forgotten how heavy faith could feel. The riders were closing their circle. Soon, they would discover the cabin's location. Ruth's sanctuary would become a trap unless she acted quickly. Her fingers found another hidden lever. This one controlled a system she'd hoped never to use. Deadfalls positioned throughout the valley. Rock slides triggered by careful engineering. The mountains themselves turned into weapons. The stranger noticed her preparation. His gray eyes widened with understanding. This woman wasn't just a hermit. She was a strategist who turned isolation into armor. Ruth pointed toward the cabin's rear wall. What appeared to be solid logs concealed a narrow passage, an escape route carved through living rock. 9 years of patient work with hammer and chisel. The stranger nodded his comprehension. He understood survival. The way he held his weapon spoke of training that went beyond frontier necessity. Military bearing hidden beneath cowboy clothes. Dawn light crept across the peaks. The riders would move soon. Ruth could hear their horses growing restless. Men's voices carried on the thin air, discussing search patterns and kill zones. The stranger's satchel caught the first rays of sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, metal glinted inside the worn leather. Not coins, something with sharp edges and official weight. Ruth's curiosity finally overcame caution. Her fingers traced the satchel's outline. The stranger's hand covered hers, neither permitting nor preventing exploration. Inside the leather pouch, her fingers found cold metal, a star-shaped badge, the weight of federal authority. United States Marshal inscribed in raised letters that her fingertips could read. The revelation hit her harder than the mountain wind. Federal law, government authority. Everything she'd fled 9 years ago lived in this stranger's pocket. The wounded man watched her face, reading the betrayal that flickered across her features. His jaw tightened, not with guilt, with understanding. Ruth jerked her hand away from the satchel. The badge burned in her memory. Federal marshals had stood by while her hometown burned. Federal authority had worn the face of corruption and cowardice. The stranger's mouth opened to speak. Ruth raised her hand, cutting off whatever explanation he might offer. Words were weapons that wounded deeper than bullets. Outside, the riders were moving. Hoofbeats echoed off granite walls. The giant was directing his men toward the cabin's location. Time was running out. The stranger struggled to his feet. The federal badge caught sunlight again as he moved. Ruth's rifle swung toward his chest. 9 years of bitter memory focused on that star-shaped symbol, but his eyes held no guilt, no shame, only weary determination and something deeper she couldn't name. The same look she'd seen in her grandmother's face when healing carried its own dangers. The satchel held more than a badge. Papers rustled inside. Documents that justified pursuit across empty wilderness. Evidence worth bleeding for. Ruth's finger tightened on the trigger. Federal authority had failed her before. Badges meant nothing when worn by corrupt men. The mountains had taught her that survival came from trusting no one. The stranger made no move to defend himself. He simply waited, accepting whatever judgment she chose to render. The same patience he'd shown while she cleaned his wounds. Gunshots echoed across the valley. The riders had found something. Blood trails or broken branches. Signs that would lead them to the cabin within minutes. Ruth faced her choice with the clarity that came from mortal danger. Trust the badge that represented old betrayals, or face 7 armed riders with only her own resources. The stranger's weapon remained pointed at the floor. He would not fight her, would not force her hand. The decision was hers alone. More gunshots, closer now. The hunters were tightening their net. Ruth lowered her rifle and nodded toward the escape passage. Whatever this man represented, he was her ally now. The mountains would judge them both soon enough. The escape tunnel carved through living rock swallowed them in absolute darkness. Ruth pressed forward, her fingers reading the stone walls her hands had shaped over countless nights. Behind her, the stranger's labored breathing echoed off granite surfaces. Gunfire erupted from the cabin above. Wood splintered. Glass shattered. 9 years of careful construction reduced to kindling and ash. Ruth's jaw clenched. The riders were destroying her sanctuary with methodical efficiency. Every hand-carved beam, every carefully chinked wall, every memory of solitude turning to smoke. The tunnel stretched deeper into the mountain's heart. Ruth had excavated this passage grain by grain, expecting someday to need its protection. The work had taken 3 winters. Now it might save 2 lives instead of 1. The stranger stumbled behind her. His wound was bleeding again. The federal badge pressed against his ribs with each struggling breath. Ruth could hear the leather satchel rustling against the stone walls. They emerged into a hidden cave system Ruth had discovered during her 2nd year on the mountain. Water trickled from somewhere in the darkness. The air tasted of minerals and time. Ruth lit a small torch from her emergency supplies. Flame revealed a cavern large enough to shelter a dozen people. Food caches lined the walls. Blankets, medicine, ammunition. 9 years of preparation for disasters that had finally arrived. The stranger sank against a boulder, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. Blood stained his shirt where the bandages had shifted. Ruth's careful work was coming undone. She knelt beside him without speaking. Her fingers found his pulse. Still strong, still fighting. The fever had returned, painting his skin with dangerous heat. Above them, boots tramped across her cabin floor. Voices shouted orders. The riders were searching for signs of their passage. Soon they would find the tunnel entrance. Ruth opened her medical supplies with practiced efficiency. Clean bandages, herb mixtures ground by moonlight. Her grandmother's knowledge flowing through fingers that remembered healing. The stranger's eyes opened while she worked, clear despite the fever. He was studying her face with the intensity of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Ruth felt his gaze weighing her choices. The federal badge should have made him her enemy. Government authority wrapped in wounded flesh. Every reason to hate concentrated in one bleeding man. Instead, she found herself drawn to his stillness. The way he accepted pain without complaint. The careful respect he showed for her knowledge and her cave. She finished rebinding his wound in silence. The torch painted shadows across granite walls older than memory. This place had sheltered her grandmother's people before white men carved the territory into counties and jurisdictions. The stranger's hand moved toward his satchel, not protective now, offering. He pulled the leather pouch open, revealing its contents in flickering torchlight. The federal badge lay atop a stack of papers, official documents bearing territorial seals. Ruth recognized some of the names written in careful script. Towns that no longer existed. Communities burned by men who wore their own badges. Her hometown's name appeared on multiple pages. Details of the destruction she'd witnessed. Names of the dead she'd mourned. Evidence that someone had been investigating the crimes that had driven her to these mountains. Ruth's hands trembled as she read. 9 years of believing herself forgotten. 9 years of carrying grief in solitude. This stranger had been gathering proof of the injustices she'd survived. The papers told stories of systematic destruction, communities targeted for the color of their inhabitants, federal corruption reaching from territorial capitals to frontier settlements, a pattern of violence disguised as law enforcement. The stranger watched her face while she absorbed the magnitude of his investigation. Years of work documented in careful handwriting, witness statements, property records, death certificates that proved murder. Ruth looked up from the papers to meet his eyes. The federal badge meant something different now. Not the corruption she'd fled, opposition to it. Justice seeking justice through official channels that might actually function. Voices echoed from the tunnel entrance. The riders had found their escape route. Boots scraped against stone. Torchlight flickered in the passage Ruth had carved with her own hands. The stranger struggled to his feet. His weapon appeared in his grip despite the wound and fever. Whatever weakness the injury had brought was burning away under pressure. Ruth counted footsteps in the tunnel. 3 men at least, possibly more. The cave had multiple exits, but reaching them would require crossing open ground under enemy fire. She moved to her weapons cache. A second rifle, more ammunition, powder charges she'd prepared for mining but could use for other purposes. 9 years of mountain living had taught her to think creatively about survival. The stranger positioned himself beside the tunnel mouth. His federal badge caught torchlight, transforming from symbol of old betrayals into banner of current resistance. Ruth found herself standing beside him, not behind, not protected, equal. The papers in his satchel had changed everything. Isolation was no longer an option when justice demanded witnesses. Torchlight grew brighter in the tunnel. Voices carried through stone corridors. The riders were advancing cautiously, expecting ambush from desperate fugitives. Ruth's finger found the trigger of her rifle. 9 years of target practice on mountain game. 9 years of preparing for violence she'd hoped to avoid. The skills were still sharp. The will was returning. The stranger looked at her one final time before the shooting started. No words passed between them. No promises. Only the understanding that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. The first rider emerged from the tunnel mouth. His torch revealed the cave's dimensions. His eyes widened at the sight of two weapons aimed at his chest. Ruth and the stranger fired simultaneously. The first rider dropped his torch and retreated into darkness. Gunfire echoed through the cave system. Muzzle flashes painted the granite walls in brief, violent light. Ruth reloaded with practiced efficiency. 9 years of mountain solitude had made her fingers quick with powder and shot. The stranger moved beside her, his federal training evident in how he conserved ammunition and chose targets. Voices shouted in the tunnel. The riders were regrouping. Professional men who understood that rushing a defended position meant death. They would try different tactics now. Ruth led the stranger deeper into the cave system. Her torch revealed passages that branched into the mountain's heart. 9 years of exploration had mapped every corridor, every dead end, every escape route carved by ancient water. The stranger's breathing grew labored. His wound was bleeding again. The brief firefight had reopened injuries Ruth's careful bandaging had sealed. Fever painted his face with dangerous heat. They reached a wider chamber where Ruth kept her most precious supplies. Not food or weapons. Documents. Letters from her grandmother. Photographs of people and places that no longer existed. The written history of a community erased by men who wore badges and called it justice. The stranger saw her looking at the scattered papers. His eyes moved from her treasured memories to the official documents in his satchel. Understanding passed between them without words. Ruth knelt beside her grandmother's letters. Faded ink described the same crimes documented in federal reports. The same names. The same pattern of destruction that had driven her family from fertile valleys to mountain caves. The stranger opened his satchel completely. More papers spilled onto the cave floor. Witness statements from survivors scattered across 3 territories. Property deeds stolen by corrupt officials. Death certificates that told stories of systematic murder. Ruth's hometown appeared in dozens of documents. Not forgotten. Not dismissed. Investigated with methodical precision by a federal marshal who understood that justice sometimes required years of patient work. Her fingers traced familiar names in unfamiliar handwriting. Neighbors she'd mourned in solitude. Friends whose deaths had seemed meaningless. The stranger had given their murders official weight. Footsteps echoed from multiple tunnels. The riders had split their forces. They were probing different passages, learning the cave system's layout. Soon they would find this chamber. Ruth gathered her grandmother's letters with reverent care. 9 years of guarding these memories alone. Now someone else understood their importance. The federal marshal had made her private grief into public record. The stranger struggled to organize his scattered documents. His hands shook with fever and exhaustion. Papers that represented years of investigation threatened to scatter in the cave's eternal darkness. Ruth helped him gather the evidence. Their fingers touched over witness statements and death certificates. 9 years of isolation cracking under the weight of shared purpose. She looked into his gray eyes and saw recognition of her true worth. Not just a mountain hermit. A survivor whose testimony could complete his investigation. The final witness he'd been seeking. The stranger's mouth moved soundlessly. Her name. He'd been looking for Ruth Reverie specifically. The federal marshal had tracked her through territorial records and survivor accounts, found her deliberately. Ruth's world tilted on its axis. 9 years of believing herself forgotten. 9 years of carrying witness in solitude. This man had climbed into her mountains seeking the truth she'd guarded alone. Torchlight flickered in 3 different passages. The riders were closing their net. Professional hunters who understood that wounded prey eventually made mistakes. Ruth stood and moved to her weapons cache. Not rifles now. powder charges prepared for mining, dynamite stolen from railroad construction crews, 9 years of accumulating tools that could reshape mountains. The stranger understood her intention. His eyes widened with appreciation for the elegant solution. The cave system that sheltered them could become a tomb for their enemies. Ruth's fingers worked with steady precision, fuses cut to specific lengths, charges placed at structural weak points her engineering knowledge had identified. The mountain itself would judge between justice and corruption. The stranger gathered the scattered documents into his satchel, evidence too important to lose. Years of investigation that could expose territorial corruption reaching from frontier settlements to federal capitals. Ruth checked her calculations one final time. The explosions would seal the main tunnels but leave the escape routes she'd mapped during long winter nights. Mathematics and mining knowledge combined to create selective destruction. Voices grew louder in the approaching tunnels. The riders were coordinating their final assault. Multiple torches, multiple weapons, overwhelming force directed at two wounded fugitives. Ruth lit the first fuse with her torch. Sparks raced toward charges that would reshape the cave system forever. Her sanctuary would become her weapon. The stranger struggled to his feet. The federal badge pressed against his ribs with each labored breath. Justice incarnate, bleeding but unbowed in mountain darkness. Ruth took his arm and guided him toward the escape passage. She'd prepared for exactly this situation. 9 years of planning condensed into moments of desperate action. Behind them, torchlight filled the chamber. Voices shouted as the riders discovered their quarry's location. Boots pounded across stone floors worn smooth by centuries of mountain water. The fuses burned toward their charges. Ruth counted seconds in her head, timing measured in heartbeats and hopes. She and the stranger reached the escape tunnel as the first explosion shattered granite walls behind them. The mountain roared its ancient rage. Darkness swallowed them as they ran toward uncertain light. The mountain's roar faded behind them as Ruth and the stranger emerged into dawn light. Granite dust hung in the air. The cave system had collapsed exactly as she'd calculated, sealing their pursuers in darkness. The stranger collapsed against a boulder, his federal badge catching the first rays of sunlight. Blood soaked through his bandages. The explosion and desperate flight had torn his wounds open again. Ruth knelt beside him, her hands finding his pulse. Still strong, still fighting. 9 years of mountain medicine flowing through her fingers as she worked to save the man who'd given meaning to her exile. Below them, the valley stretched toward distant settlements. Civilization waited beyond the peaks, carrying both justice and corruption in equal measure. Ruth had avoided that world for 9 years. Now it called her back. The stranger's satchel lay between them, its leather surface marked by granite dust and dried blood. Evidence of territorial crimes waited inside. Proof that could expose corruption reaching from frontier towns to federal capitals. Ruth opened the pouch and studied the documents with new understanding. Her testimony would complete the investigation. Her witness would give voice to the voiceless dead. 9 years of solitude had preserved the truth for this moment. The stranger's eyes opened while she read. Clear despite pain and exhaustion. He'd found what he'd been seeking in these mountains. Not just evidence. The final witness who could tie scattered crimes into one unbreakable chain. Ruth met his gaze and nodded. No words needed. The understanding that passed between them carried the weight of shared purpose and mutual respect. Justice would be served, but not through vengeance, through law applied with integrity. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they began the long descent toward civilization. The federal marshal leaned on her strength, while she drew courage from his unwavering commitment to truth. 3 days later, they reached the territorial capital. Ruth's testimony filled gaps in the federal investigation. Her grandmother's letters provided evidence that transformed scattered incidents into documented genocide. The trials lasted 6 months. Corrupt officials fell one by one as Ruth's words gave voice to the murdered dead. Federal badges meant something again when worn by men who understood that justice required both courage and patience. Ruth found herself changed by the process. 9 years of isolation had ended not in defeat but in purpose. The mountains had preserved her not just for survival but for witness. The stranger recovered slowly. His wounds healed under proper medical care, but the bond forged in mountain caves remained unbroken. He'd found more than evidence in Ruth's sanctuary. He'd found partnership. When the last corrupt official received his sentence, Ruth and the stranger stood together on the courthouse steps. Justice had been served through law rather than violence. Truth had prevailed through patience rather than revenge. They returned to the mountains together, but not to hide. Ruth's cabin was rebuilt, larger than before. The valley that had sheltered one hermit became sanctuary for other survivors seeking both safety and community. The stranger kept his federal badge but wore it differently now. Justice required roots, not wandering. Protection meant community, not isolation. His marshal's authority served people who'd learned to trust again. Ruth taught survival skills to women who'd fled violence. The stranger trained men who'd lost faith in law. Together they built something new in the ancient peaks. Safety earned through strength. Justice grounded in truth. Other survivors found their way to the mountain sanctuary. Families displaced by corruption. Communities scattered by systematic violence. Ruth's Valley became a place where the broken could heal and the frightened could find courage. Years passed. The settlement grew. Children learned mountain skills alongside reading and writing. Adults found purpose in protecting something worth defending. The federal marshal's badge became symbol of law applied with wisdom. Ruth stood on her porch one evening, watching sunset paint the peaks in gold and crimson. The stranger sat beside her, no longer strange, no longer wounded. His federal badge caught the last light of day. She remembered the kiss that had started everything. 9 years of isolation shattered by one moment of desperate human connection. Fear transformed into love. Solitude replaced by community. A young girl approached, carrying questions about herb gathering. Ruth smiled and began teaching, passing knowledge from grandmother to granddaughter across generations of mountain wisdom. The federal marshal watched his wife with eyes that still held wonder. She taught him that justice required more than badges and evidence. It needed roots, community, love applied with the same patience as law. The mountains kept their secrets but no longer held their witnesses prisoner. Truth lived in the valley now, spoken by voices that refused to be silenced. Justice wore both star-shaped badges and calloused hands that knew how to heal. Ruth's sanctuary had become something larger than safety. It was home. It was community. It was proof that broken people could build unbreakable bonds when they chose courage over fear. The sun set behind granite peaks that had sheltered hermits and criminals alike. But the valley below held something different now. Light that would outlast any darkness. Love that had transformed isolation into invitation. Ruth Reverie had found her voice again. The federal marshal had found his purpose. Together they'd built justice that would endure long after badges tarnished and mountains wore away. The story lived on in the children they taught and the community they'd created. 9 years of exile had become the foundation for generations of hope. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.